Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Kuf Nun. We're going to get started with a quick review of what we were up to because we're going to have a back and forth and we'll try to remember what we're up to. So we had our line in the Mishnah Shiur Karka Kolshu. If somebody leaves over a bit of land, meaning like they gave away all their property, but not all their property, and that was exactly the debate, how much is considered not everything, then if they get better from being on their deathbed, they get better, matanato kayemet. Okay, what happens? The gift is a valid gift because only if they gave away all their possessions did we assume it was because they thought they were going to die. If they left some for themselves, that meant they thought maybe they wouldn't, and we're still giving the gift, and therefore the gift is valid. We've seen this many times already. The big debate on yesterday's talk was how much. So we saw a small debate, not really a debate, but both really of a similar opinion, that Rav said land, it has to be land they left over, but enough land to survive on, not anything, not just any small amount of land, even a little teeny piece of land, of course, doesn't mean I left this to live on, but just something to live on. And Rabbi Yomi Abar Abba said, even movables, if you can survive on that, then if that's enough to live on, then that's considered a shiur, right? That means I left over enough. But nobody thinks that it could, right, that it could be even just one teeny little piece of land, right? It would have to be something you could actually live on. And Rav Yomi even said it doesn't even have to be land, to which Rav Yosef jumped and said, what do you, right? Rabbi Zera said, oh, it's great what you said. And Rav Yosef said, no, it's Rabbi Zera said it's great what you said because it's totally logical. Rav Yosef said, but it doesn't match the words in the Mishnah. The Mishnah said karka, which means land only, not metaltalin. So that was against the second opinion. And it said koshu, which means any sort of amount. So that's Rav Yosef's question. In the end of the sugya, I'll just kind of set it up right now. Rav Yosef's question is really going to stand. That it doesn't really make sense in terms of the wording of the Mishnah. But Abai is going to try to reject, or not that it stands and he wins, because there's still the other opinion, and there's Rabbi Zeru who supported, and there's Rav Yosef who asked the question. But Abai is going to try to reject Rav Yosef's question, but he's not going to be successful. Okay, and we already started the beginning of the rejection. The first part he's going to try to reject is who says that every time it says karka, it really means land. And he's going to prove this Mishnah in Pe'ah. And I have to clarify something a little better than I did yesterday, which is, it starts with the Mishnah in Pe'ah. He starts with the third of a series of 3 Mishnayot. We're going to read through Vav, Zayin, and Chet in the 3rd chapter of Pe'ah. So in Mishnah Chet, the last one in the series, it says, HaKotev kol nechasav lavdo. I'm starting from the bottom of Kuf Mem Tet Bet. Yatsa ben chorin, right? If you free your Eved in this way by saying, I'm giving you all my possessions, which includes I'm giving you yourself, I'm giving you your freedom, and you're acquiring all of my stuff. So Yatsa ben Chorin, the guy goes free. But Shiur Karka Kolshu, but if you say I'm giving you all of my property except for some land, well, Avadim are considered like land, although we're going to see it's not so clear cut where Avadim fall, but they are definitely considered like land for certain things. And that word land includes the slave. And therefore, it means I'm not giving you everything. I'm leaving over a little of land, which could include the slave, which means you can't say the guy went free because of that. And therefore, not only does not go free, but he doesn't get any of the property because once it goes to him, it immediately gets acquired by his master. And let's say the master dies, well, then it goes to the master's children because anything a slave owns is owned by his owner. Again, we're talking about a Canaanite slave. Rabbi Shimon Omer, La'olam hu ben chorin, and remember, what happens to a Canaanite slave when they go free? They become Jewish because they've already done a conversion. When they come into your household, they're considered part of your household. And if you were to free them, they actually become Jewish. Rabbi Shimon Omer, La'olam hu ben chorin, ad shomar kol nechasai netunim leploni avdi chutz me'echad mi'ribo shebehem. He doesn't think leaving out land would work to include the slave. Only if you say, except for one little small percentage, that little small percentage could be the slave, in which case the slave wouldn't go free. But if you said land, it would go free. Now, starting at the top of our page, this is the line I didn't explain so well yesterday. I'm going to explain it better. V'amar Rav Dimi bar Yosef amar Rabbi Elazar. Now, here's the important part for our purposes, because going back to Tanakama said, if you said land that you're leaving over for yourself, now the person's not giving the slave everything, leaving over some land, the land could include the slave. Comes Rav Dimi bar Yosef in the name of Rabbi Elazar and said, when the Mishnah said land there, it doesn't only mean land. If he left over metaltalin, they would also, Tanakama would also agree that that would mean the slave doesn't go free. Okay, and that's this next line. So Rabbi Elazar says, "Asu metaltalin shiur etzel eved." That's what it means. It means that when it said land here in the Mishnah, it could include also movables. So that means that according to Tanakama, you wrote all your property, and either you said land, or I'm leaving a little bit of land, or I'm leaving a little bit of movables. Either one could potentially include the slave. And this is going to be because later we're going to see there's a question, do slaves count as land or do slaves count as movables? And it's unclear. So because of that, any phraseology, whether it's land or metaltalin, could potentially be relating to this slave. Now, what's the issue? So now this is the line that's important. Okay, and this I didn't clarify well enough yesterday, which is, if that's the point, what does it really mean? It means when it says karka in the Mishnah, it means karka or metaltalin. That's the point, because that line is now explained by Rabbi Elazar to include metaltalin. Now, the next part is not really important for our purposes, but we will come back to this a few times today, so I'll explain it well. Below assume metaltalin shiur etzel ktuba. Now they're just referring back to the Mishnah before, and for our purposes, we're done. But we're quoting a statement of Rabbi Elazar that was commenting on the Mishnah in past, so because of that, we're gonna read his whole statement. What he was saying is Mishnah Chet, when it says land, it really means land or movables, because a slave could be included in land or movables. But when it comes to the woman in her ketubah, which is what the Mishnah said, someone who writes all of his property to his sons and gives some land to his wife, even if he gives her any bit of land, right, and leaves over, this is the key part, not the land he's giving to the wife, but leaves over nothing, right? Doesn't leave anything else, but gives out everything, divides up all of his property. So again, we have a man who thinks he's going to die, is going to die, let's say. It doesn't, right? We're talking about a case where the guy does die, gives out everything, divides to his sons and to his wife. She gets a bit of land. We assume that she does. Now, what does it mean he divides? It means the kids are no longer heirs, right? They're getting it as a gift, which means that there's nothing left in the estate anymore. The estate is empty because gift to the children, gift to the wife, nothing left in the estate. So the woman has nothing to collect her tuba with. So if she agrees to this and doesn't start screaming, what are you talking about? I'm not taking this little piece of land instead of getting my tuba money, then we assume she agrees and she's willing to get this piece of land. And this is what we talked about a while back, right? That she's happy for her status now, that she got divided, land was divided between her and the sons, and she got a piece of land. That's enough for her to be satisfied. She doesn't need the land for, that she should be getting from her ketubah, and ibda ketubata. She loses her ketubah. But this is only, where does shiur come up here? That the Mishnah says, lo asu metaltalin shiur etzel ketubah. This law is only applicable, and we'll see this also again later today. It's only applicable if the father gave away all of the land. If the father left some land over and the woman didn't say, why are you giving me this one piece of land and not more? Well, we don't assume she gave up her rights to her ketubah because she was silent, because she knew there was still land in the estate left that she could collect her ketubah with. Now, you have to remember, there's a basic law that the Gaonim changed, but there was a basic law in the time of the Gemara that a woman can only collect her ketubah from land. If there's no land left in the estate and just movables, she can't collect her ketubah. So this law is only applicable if he left land over. If he left some land in the estate, then she didn't lose her ketubah because she figured, I'll get it from there. Even if it's not worth the same amount as the ketubah, right? She figured, let's evaluate, we'll evaluate, and then maybe I'll get them to give me some of the rest. But once there's land left over, we assume she figured she collected from there. So that means if he gave away everything, she loses her ketubah, right? But if he left some land, she doesn't lose her ketubah. But the fact that she left some land, she doesn't lose her ketubah, is only true if it's land, not if it's metaltalin. So whereas in our case that we were talking about with the eved, land and metaltalin are interchangeable. When it comes to the ketubah, land and metaltalin are not interchangeable in terms of if there was a little bit left. So if the man gave away all his land to his sons and his wife, and there was some metaltalin left in the estate, since she couldn't collect her ketubah from there, even though he left some metaltalin in the estate, since she has no rights to collect ketubah from there, we do think that she reneged on her rights and she said, okay, I don't really care. I'm happy to take this land instead of my ketubah, because she knew she couldn't. You can't say, oh, well, I thought I'd get it from the metaltalin, because you can't collect ketubah from metaltalin. That's what it means, lo asu metaltalin shiur etzel ketubah. So what they're basically doing this comparison but it's irrelevant for our purposes because all we tried to prove so far was the way Rabbi Elazar understands things. The word karka in the Mishnah includes metaltalin when it comes to the evet. But what Rabbi Elazar is setting up is that they both have an issue about a shiur, right? And later we're going to connect these also, where there's one law if it's everything, one law if you leave over something. But the leaving over something in the evet case is leaving over land or movables, and the leaving over something in the ketubah case, which has a totally different relevant issue, is only land and not movables. That's the difference he's setting up here. But the main point is, for our purposes right now, is that the word karka means karka and metaltalin. That's what Abai says to Rav Yosef. But Rav Yosef or the Gemara is going to respond for Rav Yosef. We don't know, but it says, Hatan bedinu de lo litni karka. Really, that Mishnah didn't mean to use the word karka. Okay, in which case, it really meant to say, anything, karka metaltalin. But there was a unique reason why they chose the word karka. But you can't learn from here to any other time it says karka that karka includes metaltalin, because that was a unique usage, because really they could have used anything, but because of where it was and the placement of the Mishnayot, and this is why we're going to go back now to Mishnah Vav. Okay, we learned Mishnah Chet, that was our Mishnah with the Evet. We went back to Mishnah Vav, which talked about the Ketubah, and that was the comparison that Rabbi Elazar made between Mishnah Zayin and Chet. But now we're going to explain why the word karka was used. Really, they didn't mean to use the word karka, but it was a literary thing. I did Tani Reisha because in the Reisha is two Mishnayot before, it was talking all about land. So it just continued the discussion using the word land, but it didn't really mean only land. And normally when you use the word karka, it was specifically chosen to say land and not movables. And that goes back and supports Rav Yosef. But, right, this is Rav Yosef's retort. In this case, it was unique. They just used land not because they meant land and not movables. They just used land because of the context. So what's the context? Rabbi Akiva Omer. There's all sorts of laws that you need to be a landowner for. Now, if you think about, I don't know, I was thinking of like feudal times and all that, when there were landowners and non-landowners. Now, normally when you think of a landowner, you think of someone who owns land, a serious amount of land, not just a little piece of land. But halachically, there's all sorts of things that require you to be a landowner. But if you own a little piece of land, we're going to call you a landowner. Okay, it's a technical, halachic, legal issue. To be a landowner, all you need to do is own a piece of land, and then you're a landowner. So what is it relevant for? So here's a bunch of halachot it's relevant for, and that's the halacha Rabbi Akiva talks about. And this is, by the way, how we got to all these laws in the middle of Masechet Pe'ah, if you want to really know, right? So I don't know if you were wondering that, what these have to do with Pe'ah. This is, there's Nashim issues, there's, right, Eved also we talked about when we were in Gitin. It doesn't really seem to belong there, but it's because of this Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva Omer. Karka kolshu chayevet bepe'ah b'bikurin. If you own a little bit of land, you're already obligated in pe'ah. You have to leave a 60th, even if it's a teeny little bit, for the poor people. Uba bikurim, you have to bring the bikurim and say the mikra bikurim, because remember, bikurim bring the first fruits from the land that you own, right? The land, and it has to be your land because it says in your land. And if it's not your land, you don't have to bring it. Well, if you own a little piece of land and you have a tree and there's fruits, you bring them to the temple and you say the text. If you lend money on the Shemitah year, the loan is canceled. But in order to write a prusbal, which helps you avoid the whole thing, the borrower needs to own land. But even if they own a little bit of land, you can write a prusbal. This is what we call a kinyan agav. You can buy land, and with that, you can acquire other things at the same time that are not there. We're going to see a story about this later, a story we see many times in the Gemara. But you can basically say, I'm acquiring this land, do a chazaka on the land, and since you were also, as part of the deal, you were acquiring movables, even if those movables aren't there, they become acquired to you through this method of kinyan agav. So what do you see here, right? Even if you have a little piece of land that you're acquiring, a small bit, you can acquire other movable items through that kinyan of that one little piece of land. And in fact, they use it as a solution to certain things, which we'll see in a story later today. We're going to have a bunch of different sugyot, but a lot of them are going to intersect and we're going to repeat certain things many times today. Okay, so the Gemara then continues and says, Mishum hachi katana karka, because there the whole topic was who is considered a landowner and who is not. And then from there, they went into other things that related to land, even though they also related to movables, or one of them related to movables. They just used the word land because the whole topic was all land, but not really because they really meant land. It really meant land and movables. And other cases where it says land and it doesn't have it because it was in the context, use the word land particularly to say land and not movables. And that supports Rav Yosef's difficulty against those other rabbis. Okay, next question. Now we're going to do the same thing with the kolshu, because again, they took the kolshu out of context, and that's what Rav Yosef said. Kolshu means kolshu. Kolshu means anything. How could you say it's kedei parnasato in order to live off of? That's a lot more than kolshu, which usually means anything. So the Gemara again asks, and maybe it's Abaye continuing his question. And every time it says kolshu, what? It doesn't have a. Sometimes kolshu actually means a particular measurement. Okay. Well, it's true. Often kolshu means any little bit. Sometimes kolshu actually means a particular measurement and not a small one. Bahatzna. Now we're going to go to a Mishnah in Chulin in the parak of Reshit Agez, which is all about giving your first shearings to the Kohen. So Rabbi Dosa ben Harkina Somel, what's the minimum shiur for shearing that you have to give a portion to the Kohen? Chamesh rechelot gozezot maneh upras chayavot b'reshit hagez. So you have 5 sheep that each you shear 1.5. Okay, it's a measurement of weight. It's 1.5 maneh, which is 150 dinarim. So 150 dinarim times 5. Okay, that's the weight. Which according to so it's 750 dinarim, which sounds like a lot. But the Schottenstein said this is 3.2 kilo altogether, which is not a lot of weight, okay, although it is pretty light, the wool. So anyway, I don't understand the measurements as well in terms of, but that's what they say, it's 3.2 kilo. That's the amount that requires you to give a portion to the Kohen. The Chachamim omrim, 5 rechelot gozezot kol shehin. He says, no, you don't need 5 rechelot, each doing 150 dinarim's worth in weight. You need 5 sheep that you shear a little bit, right? Kol shehin. Well, now we're going to have to see what kol shehin is. It sounds like any little bit that you sheared from 5 of these sheep, you'd be obligated. V'amrina, and then they said, kama kol shehin. How much is kol shehin? Amarav, maneh upras, 150 dinarim's worth. Ubavad shu mechumashot. Right? The other guy also said 150. Well, what he means is that it's split in 5, meaning, okay, just very simply, the first opinion says you need 150 dinarim's worth times 5, right? 5 rechelim, each one 150. When the Chachamim say 5 of kolshu, what they mean is 5 of each producing a fifth of the 150. He agreed with the number 150 dinarim. But he said what it means is 150 divided, that's what it says, each one, right? Each one has to be a minimum of a fifth of that amount. Okay, so you're going to take 150, you're going to divide that number in 5, which means 30, right? 30 dinarim's worth of weight of wool from each of these 5, altogether 150. So it's a fifth of the other amount, right? So now they're going to say, look, kol shehin is a shear, though. That's 150 dinarim's worth altogether. That's a lot. It's not, and kol shehin is really 30, right? Chamesh, kol shehin of 30, of 5 of them, which would be 30 in weight. That's not nothing. That's a shiur. So that's Abaye's question, to which the Gemara answers, or maybe Rav Yosef answers. Hatam bidinu delo lidi kolshu. Really, they didn't need to use the word kolshu here, and they didn't really mean to. In other words, kolshu is not used in its normal usage, just like we said at karka in the previous. Why did they use it then? I did amar tanakama shiur rabba amar iunami shiur zutra karila kolshu. Well, what they're pointing out here is this is a pretty strange machloket. Usually, when you have a difference about an amount, it's usually half, something like that, where you differ at a certain percentage. But to differ at one person says a fifth of the amount of the other, that's a huge difference. One said a really large number, and one said a really small number. Because they wanted to highlight that there's such a difference between them, they used the word kolshu to say, this person has a large measurement, and this person says nothing. Now, it doesn't mean nothing. It means something, but the something is so insignificant compared to the other that, relatively speaking, it's like nothing. And therefore, don't understand that kolshu in other places means a real amount. No, usually kolshu means nothing. Just here, it happened to mean something, but they specifically chose that language for a side reason. And therefore, we're left with Rav Yosef's questions against these rabbis who wanted to say, not just leaving over a teeny little bit and it has to be land, but no, they said it could be metaltalin, it could be also enough to live off, and we're left with this debate. Okay. Now the Gemara is going to get to different languages that one uses. First, essentially, they focused on language of a Mishnah. Now we're going to focus on language, but language of a statement someone would say. So we're back to our shchimera. Someone on their deathbed gives away their property. And we're going to talk today about all different languages that one could use. We're going to get sidetracked with some other things, but and go back to that at the end again. What does this word mean? What does this phrase mean? What is included? Because you can imagine someone said, I'm giving you all my blank. What does blank mean, right? Or what does the word mean? And we have to know what exactly are we giving that person after the person dies and they're no longer around, that we can ask them. So pshita, it's obvious, right? Which is always setting up. This is obvious, but we're going to ask about this. Although in this case, actually, they don't. They really just describe everything. I don't know why they start with pshita here. Amar metaltale leplanya kol mani tashmish dekani. If you say my metaltale, my movable property is going to so and so, when you say my movable property, what you really mean is vessels, like utensils that are usable. You don't mean, we're going to see right now. So kol mani tashmishte, any, like your millstone, your oven, your whatever it might be, or an oven that moves, a portable. Levar michite v'sa'are. What are you not including? Your grains, right? Your wheat, your barley. That's not included. That's not the word metaltalin generally, even though you would say that's movable. But metaltalin is generally meant if you say my metaltalin, you mean my vessels, my utensils. Kob, and you don't mean your food. Kol metaltalin lefani. If you say all my metaltalin, then you're including obviously something more. And then afilu chite v'sa'are. So then you're including the chitim and the sorim. Afilu rechaim el yonakana, and even the part of the millstone that's the upper part, which is easily movable, as opposed to what's not included, levar mirachaim tachtona. But the bottom part of the millstone, which sits on the ground, that's not included because that is really considered something attached to the ground. And it goes more in the karka category because it's attached to the ground. But kol de mitaltel, but if you use the language, anything, now I'm going to try to translate this literally, that can be moved. Now, what's this rechaim tachtona? It's a big heavy millstone. Okay, the thing I can think of that's the most comparable in our lives would be a piano, right? A piano, you wouldn't say it's so easily movable. But if you had to move it, you could pick it up and move it, as opposed to a house or a pit, which you can't pick up and move. So if you say anything that can be moved, then afilu rechaim tachtona kani, then the person even acquires the bottom part of the millstone, which again is not easily movable, but actually can be moved. So that language includes that as well. Right, now we're going to get off to a question which is really connected with the previous sugya. We were talking about slaves. And the question is, how do we categorize slaves? Are slaves categorized as metaltalin or as karka? And that's the question. Avda kimakarka o kimetaltaladame. Okay, we were just talking about movables. I guess that's why we're saying it. So if you say, oh, I'm a metaltalin, will that include your slaves? So where do we fit slaves in? And we're going to try to bring two proofs. And they're not going to have an answer. And one thing I just want to point out that's interesting about this sugya, you would think this is a pretty basic question, right? We're constantly categorizing metaltalin, karka, and knowing where slaves fall in would be very relevant. What's interesting about this sugya is the question seems to be, or the answers anyway that are given, which actually don't even provide sufficient answers, but they're all said to Rav Ashi, which, why is that interesting? Because Rav Ashi is the last generation of Amoraim, and you would think that this would have come up earlier. And it's interesting that it only is discussed at the end, at least in our sugya today, to Rav Ashi. I didn't do a search about every time it comes up, but I just think it's interesting. You would have thought this would have come up in conversation in the earlier generations, but it seems to be a discussion in the time of Rav Ashi. So Amalei Rav Acha Bered Rav Avila Rav Ashi. I'm just pointing it out. I don't know what to make of it, but I think it's interesting. Tashma, let's try to learn from here. Hamochira ta'ir. We learned this already, right? In all the chapters about selling things. Machar batin shichin u'ma'arot merchatzaot u'beit abadim u'beit hashlachim avalot hamitaltalin. So if you sell a city, what's included? Everything in the city that is attached to the ground. Houses, pits, ditches, bathhouses, olive presses, okay, the fields, but not metaltalin, okay, not movables. But bisman she'amal chiva chomasha betocha, But when you say the city and everything in the city, what's included now? Afilu hayuba. Now, this afilu word is going to bother us a little bit in a bit, but right now let's just try to explain it simply. Even if hayuba behema avadim, even if there were animals or slaves, harei kulam mechulim, then all of that is sold. So now what does it seem to indicate here? Again, a simple reading without getting too stuck on the word afilu, which we're going to have to deal with. But it sounds like, unless you say the city and everything in it, right, it's only land. If you say everything that's in it, it will include even metaltalim, which is slaves and animals. So they would be in the movable category. Otherwise, if they were not considered movables and they were considered land, they'd be in the first category of included in the city. So yeah, Mark if you say they're metaltalim, that exactly explains why they're not in the first part of the Mishnah. Not in the case where you said I'm selling a city, it wouldn't be included because they're not land. But but if you say they're like land, then why wouldn't they be sold in the first part of the Mishnah? So now the Gemara says, no, wait. Okay, so you're basically saying, according to this, it's metaltalim. Well, I have a problem with that too. Ela, my metaltalim dami, my afilu. Now we're going to go back to this afilu word. If you say the city, it doesn't, right? It only includes land. If you say and everything in it, even animals and slaves. Now, animals, there's also a question. They're animals like land or animals like metaltalim. Now, if there's a question about them, what would you think it would be? It would be, the way you would write this Mishnah would be the following. If you say it and everything in it, it would include animals and slaves and even movable items, right? That's really what it should say, because that's the hierarchy. It's land, slaves and animals, which we're not sure where they go, somewhere on the scale in between metaltalin and karka. And then you would say metaltalin. Why is this saying afilu, even slaves and animals? It should be the opposite. Slaves and animals should be more obviously included, and the even should be the metaltalin. So basically, if you're going to read it as metaltalin, the only way you could read it is like this. Elamai lach lameimar, shani metaltalin denayi mi metaltalin delo nayid. There's a difference between movables that are inanimate and movables that are animate, that move. So basically, right, even though movables move, but movables are only move if you move them, as opposed to movables that move on their own. Now we're going to say the following. Even though I said the hierarchy should be land, these in between animals and slaves and movables, the way, and this is going to lead us to a different explanation, but the only way the person who thinks it's metaltalin could read this source is to read this Mishnah would be, right, land and anything attached to the ground is included, obviously, right? Then you're going to add, in addition, movables that are stationary. And then you're even going to add, when you say city, it even includes things that move around on their own. You might have thought those are different and they're not included. They're in the other part of the scale because they move. So maybe because they move on their own, maybe they're not included in the sale of a city. And comes this Mishnah should say no. Once you say everything, you mean everything, even including the ones that move. Now, okay, so what did that help us? We want to prove that it's not necessarily metaltalin. Well, since we have this line of filu that makes no sense, basically the only way to explain is that we're going to distinguish between movables that move and movables that don't move. Afilu tema kimakarke dami. Well, now we could read this whole Mishnah saying that slaves are like land. And then what was our whole problem? If they're like land, why are they not included in part one? They're not included in part one because they move. There's land that's stationary, and there's things that are qualified as land, but move like animals and slaves. And then you could say, Shani Makarke Denayid, Mi Makarke Delo Nayid. So this Mishnah could be read as thinking they're land or thinking they're movables, and either which way they're going to be an exception to the rule because they actually move on their own, and therefore they won't be included in one category, will be included in a different, or they're even included, right? Even though movables are already included, and then you would think obvious. No, it's not so obvious. They'd be included because of that. Either which way you could read it both ways. It's not conclusive. Now we're going to have another person who comes to Rav Ashi and tries to give a different answer. Amalei Ravina le Rav Ashi, Tashma, let's learn from here. HaKotev la'avdo kol nechasav. We're going to read this source again. Okay, this is time number 2 today, I think, right? We only read it twice. We're going to read it, I think, 4 times. So, HaKotev la'avdo kol nechasav yatsa ben chorin, shiur karka kol shu lo yatsa ben chorin. Rabbi Shimon omer lo, lamu ben chorin ad shamar kol nechasav yitin leploni avdi, chutz mechami riroshe ben. Okay, I read it pretty quickly because we read it already, but let's just quickly go through. We have a person who gives all his property to his slave. The slave goes free, but not if he left over a little bit of land. And then he doesn't go free. And Rabbi Shimon says, no, only if you say one small percentage of all my property, then maybe that's referring to the slave, but not the land. Now we go back to what we started today. Va'amar Rav Dimi bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Elazar. Remember what he said? Asu metaltalin shiur etzel eved. V'lo asu metaltalin shiur etzel ktuba. Now, again, let's repeat this line, what this means. The rabbi said that not only if you said a little bit of land, but even a little bit of movables you left over would also include the slave. That's Tanakama, and that's Rabbi Elazar's understanding of Tanakama. But when it comes to the previous Mishnah about the ktuba of the woman, and someone who gave away all their property but left a little bit over, the woman doesn't lose her ktuba because she figured she collected from that little bit he left over. There it's only land and not movables. Now, this isn't yet the proof, but here comes the proof. Rav Nachman. My time, what's the reason for this halacha? Why it could be even movables would include the slave, right? If you left over movables, well, and why not in the ktuba case? Because avda mitaltalahu umitaltala mitaltala have a shiur, because an eved can be considered movable. So if you, it's the whole purpose of Rabbi Elazar is to say, if you said I'm keeping some of the movables for myself, then maybe you included the slave in movables, and that's because a slave can be included in movables. That's pretty clear. A slave is mitaltalim. And why not then in the ktuba? Ktubat isha, and this is what we learned already, mekarkehu. The reason why, if you leave over some movables, we assume still the woman gave up her rights to collect her ktuba because the ktuba is only from land. And mitaltal the mekarke lo havishir. And therefore, it's not going to be considered that you left something over where she could collect her ktuba if it's movable and she can't collect her ktuba from there. So that's why mitaltal in there is not considered a shiur, but it is, right, a leftover, a remainder that's significant, but it is a leftover remainder that's significant in the eved case. Anyway, the point being, the reason for Rabbi Elazar, according to Rav in the name of Rav Nachman, and I say that specifically because in a minute we're going to reject his explanation, but we think that the reason why a shiur for an eved is metaltalim is because an eved is categorized as metaltalim, and that's why if you said, I'm giving you everything, but not some of my movables, well, that could include the slave. Okay. The problem with this, number one, is, well, then why karka? In other words, also if you leave karka, it includes the slave. So it's hard to say it's defined as metaltalin and also defined as karka, right? Our whole thing is we want to prove it's one or the other. Anyway, starting now from Amabet, Amarle, to which he said back to him, okay, who said back to who? Let's just go back, right? Rav Ashi responds to Ravina, that is not a proof because the reason is not the one you said that you quoted. Anan, we hold that it's a different reason. Why doesn't it work with the slave when you leave over either land or metaltalin? And it's not because a slave is categorized as metaltalin like you suggested. It's because mishum de lav krut gita matninana. We learn this as matninana just means we learn this Mishnah, and the way we explained it is because it's not a get kritut. Okay, this reminds us what we learned about in Gitin. We learned about what a get is. A get is something that severs between a husband and wife, in this case, between a master and his slave. And the only way that these are effective is if there's complete disconnect. Right? You can't divorce your wife and say, as long as, if you remember, you don't marry someone else, or as this person, or as long as you leave over some control of the husband over the wife, that's not a get. A get has to be where completely severing our relationship. Same thing with this master and slave. If the master says, I'm giving you all my property, except for a little bit, that means that the master-slave connection is still going to be there because the slave is now going to be, assuming this was effective, which it's not, but if it were effective, the slave would become free, become the owner of most of the possessions, but some of them would still be owned by the master. That means they're connected still. And that is not a get kritut, and that's why the eved doesn't go free. And that's why it doesn't matter if it's movables or land. It just creates this continuing connection of the master-slave relationship, which means that it's not going to be severed completely, which means the slave isn't free at all because it's just not effective. So that's why it doesn't matter metaltalin or karka, and it has nothing to do with it. An eved is categorized as metaltalin. So we end up with no answer to this question. And now we move on to another review of our daf in a different kind of way. Amar Rav Nachman, Hamisha. There's 5 cases. Ad shichtivu kol nichsehem. There's 5 halachot which are only going to be effective if you did it concerning everything. Okay, and now we're going to go back and review and go back to, this is all review except for one, which is going to be a prelude to something we're going to see in tomorrow's daf. But Eluhain, I'll just list them and then we'll go through what the five are. Shchiv Merah, person on their deathbed. Avdo, a slave. Ishto, a wife. Banav, sons. Mavrachat is someone who's trying to prevent someone else from getting to her property, her possessions. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. Shchiv Merah. So what's the Shchiv Merah? And we're going to see all these cases, there's going to be, the halacha is only going to be valid if it's everything. If you leave over, this is the big word for today, Shiur, right? L'shayel, a remainder. If you leave over a little bit, it's going to be totally different. And we know already a lot of these. Shchiv Merah ditnan. Shchiv Merah shekatav kol nechasav la'achirin v'shiur karko koshu matanato kayemet. Lo shiur karko koshu matanato kayemet. That's our Mishnah. If you gave away all your possessions because you were on your deathbed and then you all of a sudden got better, so it all goes back to you. But if you left over anything, and that was our whole discussion of today, what anything means, but if you left over a little bit of land or maybe a little bit of metaltalid or maybe a lot of either one of them, but if you left something for yourself, then the halacha is not valid anymore and your matana is actually valid. Okay? Matanato kayemet. I'm sorry, lo shiur karka koshu, sorry. If you leave over a little bit, then your gift is valid. If you didn't leave over, then your gift can go back when you get better. So that's one halacha. Again, now you understand what they're saying. If you didn't understand the language before, what it means is there's a difference in the halacha, whether it's everything or whether you leave over a little bit. Avdo, third time we're going to read this source today. Ditnan, hakotev kol nechasav la'avdo yatsa ben chorin. Again, there's going to be a difference if everything or you left some over. If you wrote everything to your slave goes free. But shiur karko koshu, if you leave over a little bit, which we just saw the reason is because you're not completely severing the relationship, lo yatsa ben chorin. Ishto, this is a review of a different sugya we saw. De'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, hakotev kol nechasav liishto, lo asa ela bitropa. If you write all your possessions to your wife, you obviously only meant, this is what we said, even though it's a tabelot, it doesn't make so much sense. You said, I'm giving you all my property. But what you really must have meant was, when I die, I want you to be in charge of all of it. I want you to be the apitropos, the steward in charge of giving it out. But I'm not giving you actually all my property. And she doesn't get any of it, right? It really is for the children. She's just in charge of divvying it up and being, investing it, whatever it might be. But if he left over some and didn't give her everything, then we assume he meant to give her what he gave her as a gift. And that she gets to keep. So that's again a difference. All nechasim, so that halacha that she's only an apitropos is only relevant if it's everything, and not if he left some over. Banav ditnan. What's the banav? That's again what we saw today. Ditnan. Akotev kol nechasav lebanav. It's the other Mishnah in Peah. If you write all your possessions to your sons, v'katav liishto karka koshu, and you gave your wife a little bit of land, ibdak shubata. She loses the rights to ktuba because by her agreeing to take this land, knowing that there was no other land on the property, meant that she was willing to forfeit her rights to the ketubah. Otherwise, she would have said, what are you doing? How can you give away everything? What about my ketubah? And she didn't say that, so she must have been happy enough to remember, this is all happy with her standing in society, that people see that she got part of the land as well, and she's happy to give up on getting her ketubah right. Mavrachat. What is mavrachat? Here's we have a case where a woman is about to get married a second marriage. She has some children from the first marriage. She knows that what's going to happen when she goes into the marriage, all her possessions that she owns go to the husband. And then if she is to die first, he inherits her. So, right, if he dies first, she'll get it back. But if he dies, let's say, 50-50 chance, depends on, I guess, their age and whatever. But she says, I don't want to lose all this money. I want my sons to have the money and they'll be written out completely because he'll get everything. So she's mavrachat. She tries to divert the property by giving it all away. So she gives away all her property to her son or something like that. She gives it to him before the marriage so that the son will get the property and she'll go into the marriage with no property. But what does she care? She's marrying someone else anyway who was going to take over the property and she'll live off of his stuff. Now, what if she gets divorced? Well, since she did it only to get rid of the property, right, to avoid her son ending up without anything, and she knew she was getting married, but what if she gets divorced? So she gets it back, basically, because it was clear she was doing it just to avoid it going to him. As soon as he's out of the picture, because he divorces her or dies, she wants her money back because also she needs stuff to live on. So that's only if she gave away everything. If she didn't give away everything but left some over, then we don't assume it was just to try to avoid her children from losing. Okay, we assume this is only valid that she can claim it back later, like the shchid merah kind of thing, because she wrote everything. Now, the comment after quoting these 5 cases and explaining what the 5 cases were, they make a point here about 4 are similar in one way that one stands alone. And this is a repeat of something we've discussed a bunch of times today, which is actually a bit of a complicated concept, but hopefully by this point you'll get it straight. Ubekulu metaltale have a shiur. In all these cases, we said everything, but not if you leave over something. Something that you leave over could be land, could be movables. Movables work the same as land in all these cases, except for which case? Levar miktuba that we saw already. The ktuba doesn't have land movables working as a shiur. Tamakarke tekino rabbana metaltale lo tkikum rabbana. The rabbi said that the woman can only collect from land. So therefore, again, what does this mean? If they divided up all the property but left over some movables, that doesn't matter. That's as if he left over nothing. And then that means the woman lost her ktuba because she forfeited her rights by accepting the land. And right, even though there were movables left over, well, what's the relevance of movables? She can't collect from the movables, right? If you left over land, she could say, oh, I was okay with this whole arrangement because I knew there was still land in the estate for me to collect. But once he divides everything, remember, if he divides it as a gift for his children, it's no longer the estate, right? It's owned by the children as a gift. They got it as a gift. It's not an inheritance. And then she has nothing to collect her tuba from anymore. But if there was land still in the estate that he didn't divide, then she could say, oh, I thought I'd collect my tuba from there, and therefore she doesn't forfeit her right. But it's only if there's land because you can't collect your tuba from movables. Ameimar Amar, mitaltale diktive biktuba ve'itnu be'inayu have a shiur. He says there is an exception. If the husband wrote, there could be a case where metaltalin would be a shiur, and that's in a very unique case, where the husband wrote in the ktuba that you could collect from a particular, let's say from my car. If my car is still there, you could collect your ktuba from my car. And his car is itnu be'inayu, it's still there in existence, and he left it out of the dividing up of the inheritance. It was still part of the estate. Then actually, metaltalin could be a shiur. So he's just trying to point out that there is a case where it could work, but it's only in a very unique case where it was already specified. Okay, now we're going to get to the next section, which continues into tomorrow's daf, which is if somebody says, Amar nichasai leplanya, my nichasim. Okay, it's a hard word to translate. That's exactly what the Gemara is getting at. Nichasim means possessions, really. It's a very general term, and that's exactly what the Gemara is going to prove, how general it is. What is included under possessions? So if you say my possessions to so-and-so, we need to know what possessions you're talking about because we need to know what so-and-so gets. Avde ikre nichse. So we're going to go through a whole list. Number 1, slaves. Slaves are called property. How do we know? We're going to basically just bring Mishnah after Mishnah, source after source to prove. You see, nichasim was used in this context to mean X. Okay, so Hakotev kol nechasav lavdo. 4th time we're going to read this today, if I counted correctly. Someone who writes all of his nichasim to his eved, yatsa ben chorin. He goes free. Why does he go free? Because nichasim includes himself. Neches includes eved. Pretty easy. Ara ikre nechse, land is called nechasim ditnan. Nechasim sheyesh lam achariyut, very famous Mishnah. Nikni bekesef b'shar b'chazaka. How do you acquire land, which is called nechasim sheyesh lam achariyut? It's property that has its possessions that have a guarantee. That's land. So here you see they're called nechasim. Okay, and how do you acquire them? With money, with a document, or with chazaka, by doing an action on the land. Glima, a cloak, which really here they mean any kind of movable clothing, vessel, utensil, something like that, is called nechasim, standard metaltalin ditnan, because also there it says v'she'en la'em achrayut, which is movables, which would include a glima and all things like that. Ein niknim ela b'mashicha. Now it doesn't say the word nechasim, but it just said nechasim that have achrayut, and those that don't have achrayut, those obviously means nechasim. So nechasim also means movables. And they're acquired in what way, right? They're acquired they're acquired by Mashicha, right? By pulling. Zuze ikre nechse. Even money is called nechasim, and that's because ditnan v'she'en la'em achrayut niknim im nechasim sheyesh la'em achrayut b'kesef b'shtar b'chazaka. That's our kinyan agav. We're at the end of the daf, and we've said it already. I'm not going to go back and explain what that is, but not right. Things that don't have achrayut, they don't have a guarantee, which is usually movables, but we're going to prove in a minute. This includes money as well. can be acquired through this kinyan agav, which we're going to explain right now, and in a story. And it's a story we've seen a whole bunch of times. They love this story. Ki had Rav Papa havale tracer alfe zuze bechozai. Okay, he had a loan out. Okay, someone borrowed from him 12,000 zuzim that were in this place bechozai, which was really far away, and he had no way to go there himself. Now, what was the problem? He couldn't send anyone to get them because nobody wanted to take responsibility for that. Who would go bring money back? Now, if you're a shaliach and you're a messenger and you're supposed to bring the money back, once you pick it up, it's your responsibility. You're a shomer. You have responsibility to bring it home. And if something happens to it, you're responsible. So nobody wanted to do that because who wanted to take responsibility for 12,000 zuzim, schlepping them from Bechozai all the way back to Babylonia? Or where they live. I think Bechozai is in Babylonia, but they live far from there. So what happened? He came up with this solution. I'm going to pass over the ownership of it. Now, how can you do that? The money's there. Kinyan agav. I'm going to give him a bit of the land. With that land, he'll acquire the money. There you see, money are nechasim that can be acquired through kinyan agav. The Mishnah referred to them as nechasim. Again, it didn't say the word nechasim, but it was referring back to the other stuff, which was clearly it was talking about nechasim, and therefore money would work. And what did he do? Why did that resolve it? Because then it was owned by Rav Shmuel. So if something happened to it, Rav Shmuel would just lose his own money. If he made it, and then Rav Papa would lose his money as well, and he wouldn't be able to make Rav Shmuel responsible because Rav Shmuel owned it. If he made it back, Rav Shmuel would then give it back to him as a gift. He would return it. But it basically resolved the problem of the responsibility. And Ki'ata, when he came back, he was so excited to see him. He went, unclear, we've seen this a bunch of times, whether it means he went out to greet him all the way to Tfach because he was so excited he was coming home, or maybe it means something else, but it shows his excitement because he thought, I'll never see this money again. Shtara ikre nichse, with this we'll end, although we're going to end in the middle. We're not going to yet have our answer because we're going to have Rabbi Bar Yitzchak who says there's two types of shtarot that we're going to talk about with some issue with the shtar being written for land. And then someone else is going to bring a third one, and that third one is going to prove our point. But let's just start with the first two, and you'll hear tomorrow's daf where we get the shtar as nechasim. So there's two kinds of shtarot here where you can change your mind before the shtar is written or is given. Amar zechu b'sadeh ze leploni v'kitvu lo et hashtar chozer b'shtar v'eno chozer b'sadeh. If I say to you, listen, I want you to acquire this field on behalf of someone else. I basically want to give my field to a third person who's not here. I say, listen, I'm giving you rights to it right now for you to pass on to this person, and go write a shtar about it and write the shtar and give it to them that they own the property. At this point, I haven't done anything with the shtar yet. You haven't written it, and I just told you to write it. I gave you a command, but I did do a kinyan with you for the field. I did, maybe a handkerchief. We lifted a handkerchief, and you acquired the field on behalf of this person. So chozer b'shtar ve'eno chozer b'sadeh. I can change my mind and say I don't want you to give them a document anymore, but I can't change my mind about the field. The field is already owned by them because we did an act of acquiring. But if I say al menach dichtavu lo et hashtar, acquire this right now, lift the handkerchief, on the condition that you'll write the shtar. And then I decide I don't really want you to write the shtar, in which case you won't write the shtar because I can change my mind about the shtar, in which case the condition was never fulfilled, in which case the kinyan is actually nothing. And that's why it says chozer bein b'shtar bein b'sadeh. Okay, so you can go back on either which one. And then the Gemara is going to say that Rav Chia bar Avin Amar Rav Huna shlosha shtarot, and he added a third. Hatre Hanit Amaran. The first two, I agree with you about those two, but I'm going to give you a third type, and that's where we're going to see that nechasim could be called shtar, or shtar could be called nechasim. And we're going to continue this list and add a bunch of other things that are included under the word possession. So a quick review of our daf today. We started with deliberating how to understand karka. Is karka always karka? Could it mean also metaltalin? Is kolshu always kolshu? Could it mean something else? Then we had and we ended with really, it was kind of inconclusive because those proofs weren't really proofs of anything. Rav Yosef question still stands. Our Mishnah says karka, our Mishnah says kolshu. How can you explain otherwise? But the other rabbis obviously still explain that way. Then we had what metaltale, kol metaltale, and kol de metaltel, and the difference between those languages. We went to as an eved karka or metaltalin. We tried to prove in two cases that from two sources it was metaltalin. Neither one was an effective proof. We talked about 5 halachot that are only valid if you say if it's all your property, and the halacha changes if there's some sort of leftover. The leftover could be land or movables other than the ketubah case where it can't be. And then we got to what nechasai includes, and we saw that it included slave, land, movables, money, and now we're in the middle of the shtar of documents also. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and B'sorot Tovot.